Our next speaker is Hiroko Ikegami, an assistant professor at Osaka University, where she specializes in post-1945 American art and its global impact. She received her PhD from Yale University in 2007, and we're pleased to learn that her book, entitled The Great Migrator, Robert Rauschenberg and the Global Rise of American Art, will come out from MIT Press next year. Please welcome Hiroko Ikegami.
Thank you for the introduction. It is my great honor to be able to present my work here. I would like to thank Cindy and Amelia for organizing this wonderful symposium. And I would also like to thank Terra Foundation for its generous support, which made it possible for me to come here with my students. They are having a wonderful time. The symposium has been very exciting for me because a number of papers intersect and overlap with one another in an interesting way. For instance, Din Nin yesterday talked about YS effect in Chinese, I suppose, academy art. And I will be talking about the Rauschenberg effect in Chinese avant-garde art scene in a younger generation. So I will start. ROCI East will start. ROCI East, considering Rauschenberg's agency in China. In the long and celebrated career of Robert Rauschenberg, the Rauschenberg Overseas Culture Interchange Project, or ROCI, has occupied an uneasy place. ROCI, which was also a name of his pet turtle. This turtle actually is still alive. It's outlived Rauschenberg. So ROCI took place as an international art project in the latter half of the 1980s, when the artist created and exhibited works of art in 11 countries. As he consciously chose areas that were mostly, I quote, either developing nations are controlled by totalitarian governments or that had little contact with the United States. The, unquote, the itinerary included in the order of travel Mexico, Chile, Venezuela, China, Tibet, Japan, Cuba, the Soviet Union, East Germany, and Malaysia, where he tried to promote peace and understanding among diverse cultures. Lofty in its aim, the project was largely regarded as unconvincing in artistic value and ethically questionable in concept when concluded with an exhibition at the National Gallery of Art in 1991. In the age of post-colonial theory, ROCI seemed to critical eyes as a project of cultural invasion in the name of world peace. However, before dismissing it as American cultural imperialism, it should be examined how host countries received ROCI. This paper focuses on China, where ROCI took place in 1985. As the exhibition coincided with the country's culture fever with Western art and culture, nobody saw it as cultural invasion. All the artists and the critics I interviewed this past summer, including Xu Bian, who is looking at the exhibit in this picture, said, no, it was nothing like that. We were so hungry for information from the outside world after the Cultural Revolution. And only Rauschenberg bothered to have a show for us, and it was great. In the local context, therefore, ROCI functioned as a much-needed catalyst for Chinese artists to begin getting familiar with the global art scene. If this was the case, how can we assess ROCI's legacy? Where do we draw a line between cultural exchange and cultural invasion? Since ROCI is an enormous project and China is a new topic for me, my disclaimer is that I'm not a specialist of Chinese art. This is really a new research field for me. So I will not try to offer a definitive answer to this question in this presentation. Instead, I will reconsider this project in a larger art historical discourse by discussing my recent research findings in Beijing and in New York. Rauschenberg's international activities date back to 1964, when he joined the world tour of the Merce Cunningham Dance Company as an artistic director. Together with the company, he visited 30 cities in 14 countries, including India, Thailand, and Japan in Asia, and Czechoslovakia and Poland behind the Iron Curtain. During the tour, he created not only sets and costumes, but also works of art from local materials. In Tokyo, for instance, he even made a major combined gold standard using a traditional gold folding screen and junk objects found on the streets. This engagement with the local culture set a pattern for his future international enterprises. However, ROCI was different in nature, as it was conceived as a peace mission. In fact, the idea for ROCI took a shape during his first visit to China in 1982. Visiting the Xuan Paper Mill in Anhui province to create paper-based works, he was shocked to see people deprived of the freedom to travel in their own country, completely disconnected from the outside world. In Beijing, where art students kept asking him questions about Western modern art, he was convinced of their need for communication with outside cultures. As he already had an idea for an international traveling show, he decided to focus on countries that had little exposure to contemporary Western art because of their political and economic systems. Constantly incorporating the artist's responses to different cultures, ROCI was envisioned as an ever-evolving, accumulative project in which people of diverse backgrounds could communicate with one another through his art. While the project seems quixotically optimistic today, it satisfied a craving for Western art in China. With the end of the Cultural Revolution in 1976, China had started receiving Western modern art by the mid-80s. In 1981, works by abstract expressionist painters such as Jackson Pollock in the collection of Museum of Fine Arts in Boston were shown for the first time in China, accompanied by a detailed catalog essay on the subject, while a Picasso show opened in 1983. However, as the anti-spiritual pollution campaign of 1983 put a hold on this trend for 1 year, it was only at the end of 1984 that the Central Communist Party started a massive program to open up the country for Western arts and thoughts. As a result, Chinese artists encountered modernism and postmodernism all at once, but mainly only through publications. ROCI China thus took place at a crucial moment, meeting their desire to see works of contemporary Western art in person. Of course, Chinese Ministry of Culture did not grant Rauschenberg total freedom to exhibit anything he wanted. Despite their need to increase cultural exchange, a solo show of a Western avant-garde artist who was still alive and very much active was unprecedented, and even considered a potential political risk. As a mediator, an American-based Chinese woman named Chunwei Su-Chen, whose husband was a respected scientist both in the United States and in China, negotiated with Chinese exhibition agency about the budget, installation, and the content of the exhibit on behalf of Rauschenberg. The agency's requirements were stringent. She should be responsible for the selection of works as well as a catalog, and the agency should check in advance all the works and the video materials to be included in the show. Plus, the contract made between her and the agency stipulated that Rauschenberg was responsible for all the exhibition expenses, which amounted to about $45,000 US. As the first Western contemporary art exhibition in the country, ROCI China unleashed a great shock in Beijing, attracting more than 300,000 visitors in total. First of all, the scale of the exhibition was unprecedented, as it occupied most of the first floor of the huge China National Art Gallery. Secondly, it was presented in multiple media, with TV monitors scattered around the exhibition. One of them introduced Rauschenberg's life and work at the entrance, while others showed his activities in other countries, as well as American popular culture, such as cartoons and the musical. Third, the entire walls of the exhibition space were repainted, which was also unheard of. Since the National Art Gallery was built in 1962 as a showcase for idealized Chinese art and communist propaganda, its walls had never been touched. Rauschenberg had the dusty walls repainted fresh white, added temporary walls, and installed his freestanding and wall pieces in the space newly fashioned to Western standards. Last but not least, the most shocking aspect of the show was his use of ready-made and other contemporary art strategies, something that had never been shown in China before. Whereas the use of everyday objects, such as umbrellas and even discarded cardboard, was demonstrated by his creations in China, the deployment of light and motion was shown in the works he had produced in America earlier. Moreover, photo transfer was visible on shiny metal plates in his works from ROCI, Chile, and his Japanese clay works demonstrated that even art history, as represented by Mona Lisa, could be an artist's ready-made material. This diversity of Rauschenberg's strategies offered a great inspiration for Chinese young artists who were already forming what would be called the 1985 art movement all over the country. Compared with Duchamp's conceptual ready-made, Rauschenberg's prolific and indiscriminate use of ready-made materials seemed more approachable and more helpful as a point of reference. Most importantly, it vividly suggested an effective alternative to socialist realism and traditional art, the two dead-end avenues of expression available in Chinese art at the time. For instance, in 7 characters, made at the Xuan Paper Mill in 1982, Rauschenberg combined traditional paper with found images of contemporary Chinese life, not in an idealized realist style, but as part of a formal composition. As the critic Li Shanting suggests, this approach provided Chinese artists with a way to deal with their reality in a non-ideological way. According to him, even artists outside Beijing made a trip to the capital to see ROCI, China, and started playing with ready-made. Here I am showing works by Song Yongping and Pingren. In their works, what we might call the Rauschenberg effect is clearly visible. While Song Yongping created freestanding combines with mundane objects, Pingren incorporated art historical references, such as Mona Lisa and a plaster cast, into his combined painting. Such a drastic artistic impact, however, combined with Rauschenberg's personal presence in Beijing, was bound to unsettle the Chinese art scene. In particular, his encounter with the local underground artists revealed an issue of cultural time lag, which I believe is a key term to understand the ambivalence of ROCI project. This encounter took place at an underground exhibition specifically organized for Rauschenberg. It was held at the apartment of Marlowe Food, an American journalist friendly with a group of underground artists who had no official art education at academies or elsewhere. They included such painters as Zhang Wei, Mark Lu, and Zhu Junxu, who had been engaged with impressionistic landscape under the banner of no-name group in the 70s, and moved on to abstraction in the 80s. Since the authorities still did not permit abstraction, Zhang Wei, a central figure in this group, held a number of underground exhibitions in his apartment, creating a cultural scene of the so-called apartment art. According to art historian Gao-Min Lu, the space of an apartment was a kind of totality, as it functioned not only as a living space, but also as a studio, salon, and exhibition space. Engaging with abstraction meant a constant negotiation with government censorship at the time. In fact, when they ventured to hold an exhibition in public in May 1985, it was banned before it opened. Since the situation was not much different half a year later, Marlowe Food suggested using his apartment to show their work to Rauschenberg. With his help, Zhang Wei organized a 7-person exhibition, including his fellow artists, Gu Daxun, Wang Luyan, Xin Yufan, and Feng Guodong, as well as the 2 painters mentioned earlier. Here I am showing a few images from the exhibition, and here is another one, just for you to see what it was like. Despite mutual interest, the evening took an unexpected turn. When Rauschenberg asked Zhang Wei if he had already seen the ROCI show, the Chinese artist emphatically answered, yes, almost every day. To this answer, Rauschenberg responded that he wanted to take Zhang Wei to the United States with him so that he could tell everybody there how the Chinese people loved his show in Beijing. Zhang Wei was so disgusted by this response that, excuse me, that he immediately started criticizing his work, saying that the more he saw it, the less impressed he was. A quarrel broke out between the two, and Junwei Suqian refused to translate Zhang Wei beyond that point. Ma Kelou and Zhu Jinxi took sides with Zhang Wei, whereas Gu Daxun and Wang Luyan found the dispute unproductive. The truth to be told, however, Zhang Wei did like Rauschenberg's work, and all the other artists appreciated his interest in their show. Why, then, did this confrontation happen at all? This is where I believe the issue of cultural time lag is pertinent. In the mid-1980s, the engagement with abstraction was at once extremely radical and political in China. But most likely, their paintings instead reminded Rauschenberg of American abstract expressionism, whose influence he had struggled to overcome 30 years ago. This cultural time lag, or belatedness, always exists between the putative center of world art and other regions. Just think about Paris and Tokyo, or for that matter, Paris and New York in the 1920s. But in this case, it was further compounded by the East-West division of the Cold War era. From the establishment of People's Republic of China in 1949 until the beginning of Deng Xiaoping's economic reform in the 1980s, China was culturally in the state of national isolation for more than 3 decades. In the meantime, the contemporary art scene of the so-called free world saw numerous trends and transitions, which on the whole resulted in the commercialization of art. By the mid-80s, indeed, avant-garde art was history. This cultural divide complicated communication between the American and the Chinese artists. Furthermore, there was a huge gap between their social standings. While Zhang Wei and others had to remain underground as long as they aspired to be avant-garde, Rauschenberg was very much above ground, an internationally celebrated artist, as well as a self-appointed cultural ambassador. During his stay in China, Rauschenberg threw a big party for government officials, and the Time magazine decided to feature his portrait of Deng Xiaoping for its cover. This did not please the young Chinese artists, who were obviously anti-government. On this cover designed by Rauschenberg, a pair of scissors cutting a ribbon signifies and celebrates the new start for China. Here, we can see the double character in Rauschenberg's combined technique of ready-made materials. Because it is basically a neutral method, it can be used both to criticize a political situation and to praise and affirm the same situation, depending on the circumstance. This double character echoes in the ambivalent nature of the ROCI project itself. While Rauschenberg was critical of the political and economic systems of the countries he visited, he willingly cooperated with their governments in order to realize his exhibitions. This ambivalence, no doubt, made Chinese artists both appreciative and skeptical of Rauschenberg's presence. Still, their meeting with the American artist had a fundamental impact on their subsequent careers. After this encounter, 4 artists out of 7 left China. In 1986, Zhang Wei and Mark Lu moved to the United States, and Zhu Jinxin and Xin Yufeng left for Germany. Feng Guodong, Gu Daxin, and Wang Luyan stayed in China, but the last 2 remain internationally active. Today, all the artists except for Feng Guodong, who passed away a few years ago, lived and work in Beijing, a new flourishing center of contemporary art and its market. In lieu of conclusion, I would like to consider the ambiguous nature of ROCI's legacy. While its significance in American art history is considered small, if anything, it became a milestone in Chinese art history, as it offered a much-needed catalyst for Chinese artists to think beyond their given conditions. Moreover, ROCI's larger significance lies in world art history, in that it prefigured an operational model for the following generation of contemporary artists, including those Chinese ones. Before the age of internet and the art in residence program, Rauschenberg established a model in which an artist travels to a foreign land and creates works of art in dialogue with the local culture. At the same time, ROCI also embodies the problematics of today's globalized art practice, such as cultural appropriation and the imbalance of capital flow. One way to reconsider the project would be to further research its organization and receptions in each place. The political need for cultural exchange, especially with the United States, varied from one local to another in the last stages of the Cold War. For instance, while ROCI coincided with Deng Xiaoping's open policy in China and Gorbachev's perestroika in the Soviet Union, cases in Latin American countries such as Venezuela and Cuba would be an entirely different story. The varying cultural time lag is an important topic for global art studies. By going beyond the nation-based framework of American art history and by talking across cultures, we can begin to assess ROCI's legacy and reevaluate it for a larger history of world art. Thank you.